In the first century Hebrew culture, do you worship anyone other than God?
Depends what you mean by worship. So the Greek word for worship used in the New Testament is, I don't know how to pronounce it, proskynene or proskunene, something like that, which typically in the Hebrew is translated in the Septuagint to that word, proskynene. In the Hebrew is a word which just means something like bow down before.
One of the discourses against the false idols takes place in Isaiah 45 to 46. And Isaiah is demonstrating that salvation belongs to Yahweh alone. And so there's this line in Isaiah 45 verse 23 where Yahweh says, "To me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear allegiance." That is, God alone is the living God. He alone saves. And so his second exodus is going to conclude with all the nations bowing down and worshiping him. Now, Paul picks up on this in Philippians 2 with the famous Christ hymn. And notice how it ends. Paul summarizes in Philippians 2 verse 10, "At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Jesus is to be worshipped as the Father is worshipped, because to worship Yahweh, as the nations are going to do, is attributed to Jesus, as Paul is explaining here. The early church was comfortable describing Jesus in this way because they recognized him as God.
Do those Gospels portray him as a divine person?
Well, like I say, I think that there's only one gospel that unambiguously portrays Jesus as himself claiming to be divine, and that's the Gospel of John, which is the latest and most theologically motivated.
Arguments like this are only compelling because we just don't know our Gospels in the Old Testament well enough. Take, for instance, Mark 6, where you have a parallel to the first Exodus. In the Old Testament, God delivers Israel from Egypt. He leads them into a wilderness where there's an impossible amount to feed. There's this great bread miracle where manna comes from heaven. And so Mark shows Jesus leading this massive crowd of Israelites with his 12 disciples, the 12 tribes. And Jesus, of course, instead of summoning bread from heaven, multiplies the bread himself. Because when Mark shows the power of God, he shows it coming directly from Jesus. Jesus is the source of the power. He does the healing. He does the cleansing. He does the multiplication. God's power is in Jesus. He's not simply a medium of it. Which is why, as in the Old Testament, God's glory passes by Moses, passes by Elijah, Jesus is then seen passing by his disciples. And what's shocking is Jesus quotes Isaiah 41:10 to his disciples. In Isaiah 41:10, Yahweh says to Israel, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I am your God." And Jesus then, as he climbs into the boat, his disciples are scared. Instead of giving them confidence that God is with them, Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Because Jesus is assuming that his presence is comforting because he's God. And this is what Mark 4 is getting at. When the disciples are freaking out in the boat during the waves crashing, Jesus says, "Do you still have such little faith?" And the point being, why don't you have faith in him? And the reason we know Jesus is commending their faith in him, which was exclusively to be faith in Yahweh, then Mark concludes the scene by going, "Who then is this that even the wind and the seas obey him?" The object of faith there is Jesus, because Jesus is being presented throughout the Gospels as God in flesh.